Hello and welcome back to Extra. So you're watching a new series which I've just started doing, and this particular series is going to be most likely a long running series. So if I can weather it, it will obviously make part of the series. So for now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a start on basically re-weathering this Hornby Scaledale, I think it is, low relief building. I did this half-heartedly probably about 5 years ago, and it was only just generally used as a scenic backdrop for when I used to sell locomotives on eBay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the preparations in place and do something completely different to this, and this item at the end of it all will make up part of my 1,000 subscriber giveaway. So the plans are on this is to create some type of paint peel effect on the actual cladding, do something with the sign, and lots of graffiti, rust, general kind of grime weathering, and rework the weathering on the brickwork as well. So first things first, I'm going to tape off everything that's not to be sprayed, and then start the process of applying the base coats ready for cracking on with the paint peel effect. So with the preparations before I apply a spray over the building, I've just taped off the brickwork all the way round, including the sides as well. Left the doors open as well because I think the paint peel effect will actually kind of look quite striking on the doors. Typically you see fire exit doors anyway, sort of the back of factory units all kind of with the paint peeling off. So I'm going to keep those as they are, and then what I'm going to do is just use a Humbrol acrylic spray. Depending on what you want to have showing through your peeling paint, depends on the colour that you want. So what I'm going to achieve is the effect of the primer that will be below obviously the top coats of the cladding, so which is normally typically a grey. So this is a grey primer, and I'm just going to coat all this cladding and everything that's not masked up, including the roof, in grey. Okay, so that's all the primer that's been sprayed on, and I'm just going to remove this masking tape. Hopefully it'll come off relatively easy. There we go, that's all the masking tape removed, and now ready for applying the base powders. So with the underlying tones, what you've got to keep in mind is when you see the finished coats of paint on top of cladding that's failed and it's peeling away, you often see the problem that's behind the actual finished paint surface, which is obviously crept through, split open, and will be sort of streaking down. So whether it's, let's say, rust, it's going to eventually break through the paintwork and you'll end up with the rust streaking down the cladding, or it may be, let's say, some kind of powder coating. So what I've done is I've got my usual mixtures of Humbrol weathering powders. Again, making sure that you do not keep things uniform to one colour, because typically, though it says this colour is rust, so the lighter shade of orange is rust, it's very rare that you will ever see one shade of rust. Obviously the deeper the colour, which means that the more corrosion that you've got, or the depth of the corrosion, so I tend to mix them up with the dark earth and of course the rust, and sort of blend those tones, but not just keeping with one colour, sort of just blending them in. So you might have a bit of lighter shade and then just darken up. So I tend just to have something like this. So you've blended the two together, but you've still also got the light shade there and the dark shade on that side. Also for, like, let's say for the powder coating underneath the main surface of the paint, I'm just going to use some white weathering powders. I've also got some Humbrol gloss coat. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the roof first of all, and the final colour on the roof I'm going to do as white. You typically see a lot of factory units which have a kind of a white cladded roof of some description on it, and the weathering tones that I'm going to lay underneath the finished white coat is going to be mainly the rust. So what I'm going to do is just apply some of the gloss varnish in various areas where I think corrosion would most likely be. Use the powders now. And just dab the various tones of the weathering powders with inside the areas where the varnish is. So once you've laid on them weathering tones, which is zoom in, it doesn't have to be tidy, you don't have to have a huge amount of powders, but just making sure that it's similar to this. And as it soaks into the varnish, it will obviously disperse the powders out. And just following the same principle on the front and the sides of the cladding, just some, again, varnish or matte coat, gloss or obviously matte coat, doesn't matter which one, random places. So I'm going to start off with the white and just getting those in various areas. As again, it's just always worth noting to just make sure that you do leave some of the powders kind of like creating that lumpy sort of effect with the powders, because when you go to put the next coat of the actual colour on top of here, obviously you're going to go over the top of all these weathering powders, and as it will be shown later, you want to be able to know where you've actually put all these weathering powders. Next stage is I'm going to change all this cladding into this shade of blue, but it's vital that to be able to make this layer of paint on top of here peeling, as a peeling effect, you mix that blue paint with some decal fix from Humbrol. So this paint's just Humbrol acrylic, and the mixtures that I do roughly 60 parts paint to 40 parts decal fix, and then just give that a good stir up. And you can see that that's about right. And the idea of this is to just give it a nice even coverage. And again, if you haven't got a steady hand along the bottom, you can always mask up again, or just originally leave the masking tape on. But I'm confident that I won't get any on the brickwork. So at this particular stage, looks a bit iffy. One of the things that you need to take note of is when you've got heavily applied powders, is rather than trying to brush the decal fix into the powders and then start spreading the powders around, is just to kind of loading your brush up with quite a bit of the paint and decal fix mixture. Then rather than trying to brush it, it's just to dab over the surface, so you're potentially just locking those powders in underneath this particular layer of paint. Okay, so I've allowed all the acrylic and decal fix mixture to dry overnight. It's got a gloss finish to it, but then that's because the effects of what the glue generally does. But when you kind of run your fingers over it, if it's got that kind of leathery feel to it, you know that it's going to create a reasonably decent peel. Also as well, I've made a start on the graffiti. This is going to be running all the way along the bottom of the model itself. What I plan to do is to do a feature on how I create my graffiti. So this gives you an idea of how I start off. It's just with a base colour, and then I start adding the various tones that you typically see on graffiti. It's not worth me kind of featuring it on this video, because it would probably take, you know, a good 15-20 minutes to sort of show you how I actually do it. So it'd be nice to have that featured on another part of this particular series anyway. So I will crack on the graffiti off of the camera, and I will also come back and just show you when it's all finished what it looks like. Okay, so what I've done is I've lightly sanded over the surface with some fine sandpaper, just to take the top layer off a little bit. And to be able to create the paint peel effect, I use enamel thinners and apply a good coat of that over the surface of this and leave it possibly for about 10 minutes, and then repeat the process again. So once the thinners has had time to soak in a little bit, I tend to just use a sharp skewer to try and pierce the surface of the paint, then just try and pull it down to a certain point, then you create that realistic looking peeling effect. Again, where you see all the areas where the powder is, you can break through the surface and just draw out those powders by applying a little bit more thinners, and streak any of the powders down the front of the building. Also with the thinners as well, it actually takes the shine off of the painted surface that I applied. And it's just a case of just keep on working thinners into it just to keep it soft, and that way you'll eventually get there. I'll crack on with this and show you the end results once all this is done. As I'm always experimenting with things as well, just another tip as well, just thinners again, and all I'm doing is I'm going sideways with it, which seems to be kind of peeling it from the edges of the actual cladding. And I think really the actual effect of that looks pretty striking. So I'm pretty pleased so far the way that the peeling effects turned out on that, and obviously some of the powders that were locked in underneath have created the various streaks. I'm going to enhance them a little bit more by brush, and obviously along the top of the roof line I'm going to incorporate a load of rust to sort of blend in with the rust that's on the roof. Obviously the area where the sign was, I decided to peel that right the way back to the writing because rust looks really effective on a white background. So what I'm going to do is where the actual lettering is, I'm going to cover that up with lots of spots of rust and then start creating some kind of sort of rusty sign that would have been there, and try and blend it in with the paintwork that's already there, which is, as you can see, quite heavily peeled. So when it comes to creating weather and powder effects, a lot of people would pick up maybe one or two colours again and maybe mix the two together to try and create that sort of natural dirt and grime colour. One thing I know and one thing I've learned is I tend to add an awful lot of white to the tones of greens, browns and some of the other shades of weathering powders that you get, and that white enables sort of like the change of colour to almost like a sort of a muddy shade of grey, if that makes sense. I think it's always an overlooked colour. You think white's going to change it to the wrong sort of colour, whereas in fact white really does change something that looks unrealistic into something that is fairly real. So I'm going to play around with this little pot of weathering powder that I have here, add probably a lot more white, maybe some shades of green, to create that sort of everyday grime and algae that you typically see, let's say, around your fascia boards and stuff like that. As you can see, I've tipped out the contents of that pot into here after adding some further white to it, and it's changed it from that orangey brown into now that kind of natural sort of dirt and grime colour. Always a lesson just to keep on playing around until you're totally happy that you've got the correct colour. So I'm going to add a bit of green and see what I get from that. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to dry brush with just the powders just along the bottom, just to try and blend that graffiti, make it look like it's been there just a little bit longer, right, so it doesn't look like it's fresh and brand new. And just add some of the dirty grime tones various places. What I like to do after I've done that is just to grab the thinners and just lock the powders in, so basically when I come to seal the whole lot in with the airbrush, it doesn't blow all the powders off and you're left with nothing. Again, with just the roof areas, I've lightly dusted on some of that weathering powder tones, and I just like to sometimes just add a little bit of thinners in there with hope that it will disperse or create the effects of water sort of dripping down the roof. Final part is just to conceal the sign. I've just done set in some matte coat varnish and then let that go tacky before dabbing some of the mixture of rust and brown weathering powders. And just to enhance the depth of the rust, it's just to dab it in with some thinners, and that way it sets the whole lot in. So I'm quite pleased with how that's turned out. What I'm going to do now is just let all the paint and stuff dry. Then some point tomorrow I will go over this with the airbrush with some matte varnish to seal the whole lot in. Okay, so that's generally all the weathering effects and tones all applied. One quick note I will say is when you apply the powders on any model, if you feel that you've got it just right, always apply a little bit more than what you think you actually need, simply because when you come to spray all the varnish over this, you will lose up to about sort of 40% of the tones that you've actually applied. So I always go a little bit heavier with the powders, knowing that when I come to airbrush the varnish in, you'll end up with the perfect sort of tones still remaining. For the varnish that I use in my airbrush is this. I've just diluted, I tend to buy one bottle and just split the bottles into two and dilute them by half, and they go through the airbrush perfectly. And I just give it a gentle pass over, very lightly, just to seal it in, and then go back over it again once that's dry with a second coat. Quick view of the roof, and that's just got kind of almost like a white weathered wash effect to it, and then them added tones of dirt and grime, and obviously the rust, which was originally underneath the paintwork, which as a result of applying the thinners over the top, drew those rust colours out through the paintwork. Just perfectly, that was. So I'm going to crack on and airbrush a lot up, and then I shall show you the finished results. So there we go. We've finished off all the airbrushing. Everything's all been sealed in. So it just goes to show that if you do have any sort of particular item which you think is beyond repair, then you can spend the effort and time in creating something unique. So I'm going to leave this video here, and again, as it's a long running series, I will be back pretty soon with something different. But also remember as well that this particular item is going to be up for grabs in the 1000 subscriber giveaway, amongst other items as well. So if you've got any questions, comments, please do ask. And also as well, please like and subscribe to the channel. So thanks for watching.